That's gonna. I'll try to project, but this never seems to work very well. But anyway, we'll try to give it a shot. Yeah. Okay. I got it. We'll put it right here. And thank you. One of the things when I was growing up, I had this sort of academic side 9 months of the year when I was in school, so I was a real nerd. And then in the summertime, I wanted to go just the opposite. So I tried out for this lifeguard ocean rescue squad. And this was a group that started in 1930 and has a remarkable record of saving lives. There's a book with that title about the history of the beach patrol. And every 3 years they have a reunion. And I came just 3 weeks ago. So I'm still on a high from this. And I just came from the reunion. I was one of the oldest ones still there. And I was the first one to be inducted in the Hall of Fame that was still alive. So that's, one of those things that was kind of fun to receive. Just to ask you if you don't mind turning off your phones, just so that I'm the one that usually gets a call in the middle of these things. So I finally remembered to turn mine off, and that helps. Ivey and Crook. Atlanta owes a notable debt to Ernest Daniel Ed Ivey for a historic step he took in 1907 to establish architectural education in Georgia at the then 20-year-old Georgia Tech. And indeed, Ivey and Crook's firm historian William Mitchell surmises that this is the reason that Ivey was advanced to AIA fellowship when his partner, designer Lewis Crook, was not. But Ivey was born 2 years after the Georgia legislature authorized the establishment of a state school of technology. And when classes began in 1888 at Georgia Tech, the only degree offered was in mechanical engineering. Majors in civil engineering and electrical engineering were inaugurated in 1897, but while architecture had been authorized in the initial bill, the legislative bill creating the technological school, there was no architecture program when Ed Ivey enrolled as a civil engineering student. In 1907, he was barely out of his teens. Ivey met with Georgia Tech President Kenneth Matheson and requested the establishment of an architecture program. Matheson hit the ball right back into Ivey's court, challenging him to find enough students, and the number differs depending on who you read, to suggest they had a serious interest in studying architecture. And Ivey went out and did that. And so the architecture program at Georgia Tech was established in 1908. By 1909, Francis Palmer Smith was appointed head of the architecture program and firmly established the curriculum and the design traditions as a Beaux-Arts school. That is, it's based on classical training as was established at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Smith had studied at the University of Pennsylvania under French architect, Beaux-Arts architect, Paul-Philippe Cré, and modeled Georgia Tech's curriculum on that at Penn, one of the best design schools in the country. Ivey, who was a member of the class of 1910, served as president of the Architecture Club during his senior year, and preceded by nearly a decade his future partner, Louis Edmund Buck Crook Jr., who was also selected when he was a student as Architecture Society president, and he received his BS in architecture degree in 1919. Both students benefited from the tutelage of Francis Palmer Smith, who continued to head the school until 1922. The 19-teens was a fruitful decade for Beaux-Arts design education at Georgia Tech, with Smith's most notable students including W. Pope Barney, the class of 1911, Philip Trammell Schutzey from the class of 12, William Elliott Dunwoody Jr. from 14, Flip Burge of Burge and Stevens, which is now Stevens and Wilkinson, the longest continuously running architectural firm in Atlanta, from 1916, and his future partner Preston Stevens, 1918, McKendra Tucker of Tucker and Howell from 1919, and Augustin Constantine in 1921. All of these became leaders in classical architectural design in the Southeast and beyond. In practice, one of the most prominent architectural firms of the 1920s was Hence, Reed, and Adler. Neil Reed, famous name of architecture in Atlanta, established in 1909 as Henson Reed and led by principal designer Neil Reed. There, Buck Crook met Ed Ivey. They both were draftsmen in the firm, both tech graduates and serving under Neil Reed. Although Ivey was already accepting independent commissions as well, and in May of 1923, the independent firm of Ivey and Crook was established. These were also years of progress in the professionalism of architecture. In August of 1919, 2 months after Crook's graduation, the governor of Georgia, encouraged by the Atlanta chapter of the American Institute of Architects, created a state board for examination and registration of architects. The legislature allowed an architect to be registered without examination if the applicant, as was the case with Buck Crook, has a diploma of graduation from an architecture college or school approved by the American Institute of Architects, together with at least 3 years satisfactory experience in the office of a reputable architect, which of course he did under Neil Reed. So Crook received Georgia's license number 128 on December 14, 1921. William Mitchell has characterized Ed Ivey as a specialist in the engineering aspects of architecture, and Buck Crook was Neil Reed's chief draftsman. He was the designer, and ultimately he became the designer in the partnership of Ivey and Crook, in the same way that in the partnership of Pringle and Smith, Smith was the designer and Pringle went out and got the business. Reed certainly held Crook in high esteem. He invited Crook to accompany him on a sketching tour of England, France, and Italy between April and July of 1922. And this was described by historian Mitchell as, quote, a high point of Buck Crook's youth, education, and apprenticeship. When Ivey and Crook resigned from the firm to form their own independent project or practice, one of the new firm's first commissions was to supervise the construction of the Andrew Calhoun House, this grand Italian villa built in Atlanta and still on West Pacey's Ferry Road. This was a Reed project for which both Crook and Ivey had executed working drawings while they were still working in Reed's firm. The Ivey and Crook partnership, formed, as I mentioned, in the spring of 1923, was characterized by a successful division of labor between the two partners, assisted by a few draftsmen in an office that never was very large in numbers. Principal designer Crook made preliminary drawings and then converted them to working drawings, while Ivey utilized his strengths in construction by preparing specifications and serving as clerk of the works, which meant he would supervise on-site building. And although the small colonial revival residence of Henry Wagstaff from 1923 at 2542 Habersham Road in Atlanta is considered the firm's first independent commission, he, in fact, did build other works when he was working with Neil Reed. This was the first formal commission of Ivey and Crook. The more notable first major commission of note was the Walter Turner Candler residence known as Lullwater Farm from 1925, later named Lullwater House, and today the home of the presidents, one after another, live here, of Emory University. Lullwater House reflects the eclecticism of the day, its dressing its exterior in picturesque neo-medieval forms, including half-timbering, second-floor overhangs, grouped small-pane windows, a prominent crenellated polygonal entry tower, while featuring inside designs of an entirely different character, a sweeping federal-style elliptical staircase inside that crenellated medieval tower, and classically arched doors with cantilevered balcony supported by Italianate console brackets, all projecting into this entry reception space. And from the same period as the neo-colonial Wagstaff House and the Georgian Revival residence for Mrs. Morris Eisenman from 1923, Ivey and Crook designed in a variety of period styles. Notable during these same years, and this is dates also from 1923, is the Italianate house El Paradiso in Druid Hills, the home of Fenn, Orlis, and Stone, and shamefully demolished after years of abandonment and neglect. A 1979 fire, thought to be set by vagrants occupying the long abandoned property, destroyed the mansion, which since 1976 had been the focus of preservation efforts by neighbors and others seeking to save the neglected Druid Hills mansion. A major loss on Ponce de Leon streetscape at the prominent intersection of Clifton Road, El Paradiso, was replaced in the 1980s by a 21-unit cluster of housing development, transplanted suburban houses in the heart of Olmsted's landmark Druid Hills district. These are not the most popular houses in Druid Hills. Despite the occasional exercises in Tudor revival or Mediterranean styles, Ivey and Crook built their reputation around classical revival structures, ranging from temple-fronted residences and churches to nearly 40 buildings for Emory University, as well as stripped modern classical commercial buildings and public housing. Crook viewed the classical revival as able to fulfill the very requisite of our present-day mode of living. It was elastic and simple enough for modern use, and above all, it possessed scale and proportion. This is a quote from him, which is far in advance of what we are generally doing today. By contrast, Crook was often overheard saying that by the post-war period, they're teaching orange crate architecture at Georgia Tech. This is, of course, Paul Heffernan's masterly tactile engineering building, and the architecture building. The architecture building is still extant. In 1952, on the other hand, architect Arthur Neil Robinson observed, quote, "Mr. Crook is one of the few designers in this area who has successfully preserved in his work the spirit, the charm, and the refinement of historical Southern architecture." Well, the red brick Neo-Georgian house for John Howard Candler on Lowwater in Druid Hills, which is on the left, reflects this interest in establishing a revival of traditional Southern architecture in Atlanta. It features a main block under hipped roof with dormers, 12 over 12 windows with black shutters, tall chimney stacks, flanking wings, and an arched entry rising into the entry porch pediment. The Otis barge residence of 1932 on the right further elaborates the Georgian Revival image with a prominent Palladian window over a round entry porch, the latter supported by Roman Doric columns and sheltering a semicircular entry with side lights. Both the entry bay and the main block are accented with coins, in sharp contrast with the red brick walls, and a strong string course marks the separation of the ground floor from the upper stories. In the years between the Candler and the barge houses that we just looked at, Crook designed model houses for Lenox Park development in the 1930, one of the suburbs near Morningside, evidencing further variations on colonial themes. On the left is the Chateau, which is a model house for Lenox Park, three-bay Georgian, Neo-Georgian residence with brick coins, high-hipped roof, simpler trabeating entry porch. The Barclay on the right projects asymmetrical gables with a high-hipped roof block and a more picturesque composition with simple round-headed entry door, projecting bay, and open side porch. Centrality then returns to the Sussex, a third model house for Lenox Park development, on the left, where a gabled main block recalls Virginia brick colonial residences, further elaborated by a pediment and three-bay projection with a prominent entry door and with segmental arch and flanking fluted columns. These Lenox Park houses were marked originally by these entry piers in brick, these monuments with an urn on top, simple brick piers with stone accents and a festoon urn with finial. These also designed by Ivey and Crook. And in the early 1930s, 12 of these duplicate piers were also erected. In 1989, they were revived to mark the entries into Morningside. So as you're driving around either Morningside or Lenox Park, you'll see these sometimes in people's front yard because that's the entry into that particular suburb. Crook's extensive kit of parts contributed to a variety of traditional colonial and Georgian forms and decorative accents, always balanced and well composed, a gentlemanly Southern architecture, masterfully embodied in his own residence, which we're looking at here from 1938. As Crook wrote in 1931, quote, "The capable designer thinks in terms of beauty and economy, which come from the right proportion of masses and scale of details that make for architectural perfection," unquote. Well, among the firm's residential buildings are fraternity houses for Sigma Alpha Epsilon at Emory from 1927. The same fraternity built a SAE house at Georgia Tech in 1940 and at the University of Georgia in 1929. The two in Atlanta, which we're looking at, the Emory and the Georgia Tech one, are dominated by colossal tetra-style ionic portico. That means it's a temple front. Tetra means four, so it has four columns across the front and offset against the two-story brick Georgian Revival residence and multi-pane shuttered windows and hipped roof. All that is the kind of vocabulary of Ivey and Crook's kind of classical temple-fronted house. In Athens, 1935, Crook renovated the interior of an 1845 house, the Ross Crane House at left, and added side wings, which are seen somewhat in the right views. The Grand Southern Mansion's 6 colossal Greek Revival piers. So if you know your Latin, that means it's a hexa style, not a tetra style. Portico, dominating this neo-Greek domesticity, a collegiate Greek life embodied in an antebellum historicism. And of course, the town at University of Georgia is called Athens. You can't get more Greek than that. So there we are. Well, Ivey and Crook designed notable architecture at Emory University as well. They were responsible for what I call the sort of second wave of collegiate buildings on and around the historic quadrangle, which was initially projected to look like this when Henry Hornbostel from Pittsburgh first projected the image of what he was going to build for Emory University. The focus was always on, for Hornbostel, on this colossal centerpiece building, and he was responsible for the initial college buildings that formed Emory's historic quadrangle. And the quadrangle's gotten a variety of interpretations, and if you'll forgive me, I'll show you one of them. In 1916 to 17, Hornbostel's law building, theology building, chemistry building, and physics building began to shape a collegiate quadrangle at the heart of today's Emory campus. Some have since claimed that the Coca-Cola mogul Asa Candler's role in establishing in Atlanta the campus of Emory, as well as the long-standing relationship of Emory with the Woodruff family, were forever imprinted in the shape of the quadrangle in its open space, which wags have suggested form the outline of the traditional Coca-Cola bottle. So that caused Emory to develop a nice warm-hearted connection with Coca-Cola. And there is today a tradition of the Coca-Cola toast that starts the freshman year at Emory as their experience, and then at graduation, they repeat the Coca-Cola toast. And in 1982, this tradition began when 3 Emory students organized a mass student gathering of more than 2,000 to attempt to earn a place in the Guinness Book of Records for the, I think the category was non-alcoholic toasts, and trying to get as many people to participate. And I believe the record was 2,283 students at Emory were recognized. Soon after, that tradition emerged as the annual Coca-Cola toast for freshmen at the beginning of their career and at graduation. that led some people to refer to Emory as Coca-Cola U, which is a little rude, I suppose, but anyway, there it is. Now, following Hornbossel's initial flanking buildings for law and theology and history and chemistry, it was sort of chemistry and physics together, which were along the edges of the developing quadrangle. Ivey and Crook early on closed off the quadrangle at one end with their 1924 to 26 Candler Library, for which they served as associate architects with Edward Tilton, who was the principal architect. And 3 decades later, they closed off the other end of the quadrangle with their administration building, commissioned in 1948 but not built until 1955. Soon after the library in 1926 to 7, the firm added 2 upper floors to Hornbossel's chemistry building, which is now the humanities building. And opposite the chemistry humanities building is Ivey and Crook's 1950 history building. And then in 57, they added a Bishop's Hall, which was built behind the theology building. Unfortunately, Bishop's Hall is now razed. All of these buildings continued Hornbossel's aesthetic of block form buildings with wide eaves, arched windows, red tile roofs, and featuring this distinctive pink and gray marble facade. The elevations utilized residual marble slabs from the quarries at Tate, Georgia, which was one of the great quarries in the state of Georgia, laid in random quilt-like patterns suggesting the forms of Italian villas and building characteristic, the kind of work that you sometimes see in Renaissance Tuscany, according to the National Register of Historic Places. An early work of the firm for Emory was Ivey and Crook's 1926 dining hall, an elegant classical villa form, accented with a projecting central block with pedimented windows, roundels, and a large segmental arch over the entry. The dining hall's exterior facade became a theatrical focal point for the masterful Palladian-inspired interior of John Portman's 1986 Dobbs University Student Center, a notable work of Atlanta's internationally renowned architect, which was shamefully razed in the summer of 2017 and is no longer there. It was difficult to enter John Portman's Dobbs Student Center and looking with the backdrop of Ivey and Crook's dining hall without thinking of Andrea Palladio's Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza, Italy of 1580. And indeed, the backdrop of the 1926 window dining hall frequently served as a kind of theatrical setting for club photos and impromptu selfies and fraternity club membership photographs or athletic teams, group pictures, all kinds of documentation of Emory's student life. The trade-off when Emory demolished Portman's complex to make way for a new and what I would call sort of intentionally new student union dramatically shortchanged the educated student who appreciated the classical tradition of Emory and references to Palladio in favor of what I think is a bit more of an in-your-face megastructure of high-tech imagery and bland furnishings reminiscent of an overscaled Hampton Inn motel lobby. So that's what Emory has now for their student center, and I sort of shed a tear when Portman's work was torn down. But the dining hall was saved through all of that, and in 1949 to 50, Ivey and Crook affixed to the east side of the dining hall another building called the Alumni Memorial Hall, with exterior marble surfaces, much like the other campus buildings that they had put at Emory. But at the dining hall and Alumni Memorial Hall, Ivey and Crook displayed a more pronounced classical articulation of strong coining, accented string courses, cornices over lower windows, an open balustraded parapet, arched entry enriched with pilasters, and a broken segmental arch. To the extent that Ivey and Crook's post-war quad buildings, the history and chemistry and Bishop's Hall, appear restrained and minimalist, their dining hall and their Alumni Memorial Hall were quiet but articulate gems of Beaux-Arts artistry. In both and there's a another kind of nice view of that. In both the dining hall and the alumni hall, alumni memorial building, classical adornments such as projecting pediments and segmental arches and other accents were part of what made it a nicely articulated classical facade. Segmental arch crowns the entry of both with a rusticated banding enriching the jambs. The dining hall entry was flanked by windows with pronounced pediments and projecting sills supported by classical brackets, while windows in flanking wings were round-headed. Roundels further accent the projecting entry bay of the dining hall, while it's noted a partially open balustrade caps the projecting bay of the alumni building entry. With all the adding and subtracting occurring at this student center site, both Ivey and Crook's elegant and ennobling dining hall are nearing its centennial, as well as their attached, in fact, now they pretty have well reached them because I think they date about 25. And the attached 1949 to 50 Alumni Memorial Hall has also thankfully been preserved. The dining hall now faces an open campus plaza, while the Alumni Hall behind serves as something of a DEI center. It is the home for the Black Student Center, the Center for Women, the Latino Hispanic Heritage Center, the Office of Spiritual Life, and the Barclay Forum, which is the university's debate team. Now, contemporary with Ivey and Crook's 1926 Emory Dining Hall is the Crum and Forster building on Spring Street in Atlanta, right at the edge of Technology Square, designed in association with Helmley, Corbett, and Harrison of New York. Crum and Forster is a national property and casualty insurance group founded in 1896, and the Atlanta headquarters on Spring Street, built 30 years later, is a neo-Renaissance palazzo of brick construction with a dominant recessed triple-arched loggia. Both monumental and human-scaled, the elevation composes its three colossal arches, pedimented flanking windows, and unadorned cookie-cutter upper fenestration, and continuous overhanging cornice in a manner that's both historic and abstract. It has a nice restrained quality, but it also is clearly based on Renaissance design. Now it is almost engulfed by the surrounding Portman and Associates Coda building. The Crum and Forster building was the object of major preservation efforts between 2007 and 2013 to try to preserve the building and to preserve its pedestrian scale along Spring Street on the edge of the much student-trafficked Technology Square. These newer, aggrandized Midtown development buildings were swallowing everything in its path and dramatically changing the scale of the district. The half-hearted attempt to amputate the rear two-thirds of the building at least preserved the facade. And this was a gesture which I say was some pun intended, that would save face. It saved the facade, but the Atlanta continued to bear witness to the nearly completed disappearance of the really historic fabric of Midtown, which has very few buildings of this quality, but you can see how they sliced off the back two-thirds. 2 years after oh, there it is again. I'm sorry, I had the wrong one up. 2 years after the Crum and Forster project, Ivey and Crook designed Druid Hills High School, whose facade was an amalgam of colonial and Georgian ornament and classical enrichment. Recalling American colonial town hall design, the school facade features Flemish bond brick surfaces and brick coins, a stone frontispiece with flanking Ionic columns on the principal level and scroll neck pediment capping the upper level, an upper facade oculus, a circular window with festoon, the center bay capped by an unadorned pediment, and 12 over 12 windows topped by stone semicircular and jack arches with keystones. The frontispiece's elevation displays an almost mannerist delight in ornament. Well, during the following decades, Ivey and Crook continued design work for schools at the elementary, high school, and college level. Their Haygood Elementary School of 1938 funded by the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was a restrained brick structure with a minimalist classical entry. It's still there, capped with a pyramidal roof. In recent years, the building has served as the women's division of the Atlanta Union Mission. Also part of several federally funded projects was this massive complex of Clark Howell homes. This was Atlanta's third major public housing project after Techwood homes and university homes. Some of you may know that when the federal government under FDR was going to get in the business of creating public housing, federally funded slum clearance and public housing, the very first one in the country was Techwood Homes, just south of Georgia Tech. And that was designed for whites, and University Homes near Spelman was designed for blacks. And the third one was Ivey and Crook's work with several other architects on Clark Howell homes. The design team for this huge complex included Hentz, Adler, and Schutze, as well as A. Tenike Brown, Pringle and Smith, and Ivey and Crook. So there were four major Atlanta architects involved. This whole thing contains 63 buildings and 603 units, housing units, built for whites again. Like other public housing projects of the day, which sought to provide good contemporary design and amenities, by the 1960s, Clark Howell housing began to deteriorate to a slum condition, and amenities and it started to be plagued by crime. And that was not the image that by the mid-1990s Atlanta wanted to project for the Olympics that were coming to Atlanta. So one by one, in preparation for the 1996 Summer Games, all these housing projects were demolished. Techwood Homes, University Homes, there'd be a little glimmer of a building saved for historic reference, but most of them were lost. At Clark Howell Homes, only the community center survives from that project. There you can see the individual housing of Clark Howell Homes. After World War II, Ivey and Crook firm remodeled Edward Doherty's 1911 elementary school known as Cook Elementary School. That remodeling took place in 1945. And effectively, they took an old brick school building, and started classicizing it. The main entry, the end pavilions, plying fluted pilasters, a Greek fret ornamental frieze, and a restrained pedimented entry. And at each end, there was a cafeteria, I think, at one end, but accenting the auditorium elevation at the end with similar features. Well, Ivey and Crook's classicism, particularly in commercial architecture, became increasingly abstract during the 1930s. Some say it's the Depression years and the restraints of the Depression, but there was a general kind of abstract modernism that began to tone it down a bit, but essentially reflecting the economies of the day. And of course, it was influenced by the increasing so-called white architecture of Europe. At one extreme was the firm's most abstract strip classicism, as seen in facades of the municipal swimming pool and pavilion at LaGrange, Georgia, from 1934, and especially the firm's shop fronts on Peachtree Street for Weinberger's and for Thompson Bolden Lee Shoe Company in Atlanta, both dating from 1939. I started describing this style as modern classic. It had the abstraction of modernism and the classicism in terms of balance and the like, and full-blown modern classic from 1935 by Ivey and Crook is the Olympia building downtown at 5 Points, and also the partially extant Rhodes Center around Rhodes Hall up in Upper Midtown. The smooth surfaced white marble lends an abstraction to the rows of shops in each of these commercial blocks, while close inspection discloses that there are Greek frets, fluted pilasters, wave motif string courses, dental work, and at Rhodes Center, pediments with acroteria, but generally a smooth building skin, except for the fluting. I think I skipped over that. There, that's the Rhodes Center. Hope that's not got a life of its own. That changed without me pressing it. A late example of Ivey and Crook's stripped modern classic is the Presbyterian Center in Atlanta, which is on the far left, designed in 1950 but not built until 1961. Its clean wall surfaces reflects the more abstract, volumetric, and unadorned post-war aesthetic, while its crowning lantern is straight-out Greek revival. This is a feature that if you go to Athens, Greece, you can see on the right there is a choragic monument to Lysicrates, one of the great classical monuments still surviving just below the Acropolis, and that's sitting on the roof of the Presbyterian Center. It's an idea that he could well have gotten from William Strickland, who in Philadelphia placed the choragic monument on top of his Merchants Exchange on the right in Philly from 1934, and then a few years later did the same thing at the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville, which dates from 1959. Well, during the 1950s, Ivey and Crook were back at Emory, designing a host of buildings in a major second phase of expansion at the college, including, as we noted earlier, the History Building from 1950, the Administration Building from 1955, and Bishop's Hall, now lost, from 57. The firm was also designing for Agnes Scott here in Decatur during this period, including the main gate to Agnes Scott, which is seen on the screen and dates from 1950. The gate is a rare exercise for Ivey and Crook in Gothic revival, and like a lich gate entry to an English churchyard, it provides a kind of momentary shelter under a pointed arch at the buttressed portal into the collegiate Gothic campus. Ivey and Crook's Francis Winship Waters Hall, it's a dormitory at Agnes Scott, was sited near Edwards and Sayward's earlier Buttrick Hall and McCain Library. Those of you who came to my earlier lecture on William Edwards may recall those buildings. But Waters Hall reflects post-war economies and still is more restrained than the earlier Edwards buildings. This dates from 1954 to 6. The Waters dormitory minimalist medieval forms parallels Emory's minimalist classical forms in the Ivey and Crook repertory. And during the post-war period in Atlanta, while more progressive firms were moving toward greater abstraction of steel and glass architecture and a closer reflection of the Bauhaus style, Ivey and Crook continued their more explicit classical formalism in both residential and in church architecture. Houses frequently featured tetrastyle porticos, these four-column temple fronts, usually white Ionic temples, recalling what Marcus Whiffen once called Jeffersonian classicism, because Jefferson did the same thing at Monticello. The L.E. Grant residence of 1948 and the Julian Harris residence of 1950, both in Atlanta, similarly employ Greek revival device of an unadorned broad cornice under the roof eave, accented by rectangular attic vents, which were intended to call to mind metopes on classical Doric Greek temples. And while the intercolumniation of the portico is evenly spaced at Harrison House, Crook more usually widened the central bay to open the central axis and porch entry to an arched doorway behind. The Grant House of 48, the Marcus Emmert House of 51, Fred Patterson House of 51, all in Atlanta, as well as the LaGrange College Library from 1948 at LaGrange, Georgia, are all examples of that slightly widening of that central pair of columns. Colonial sources also informed Ivey and Crook's post-war church designs, of which there are a number of them around the city. These are based on the Gibbsian model, that is the work of James Gibbs in England, at St. Martin's in the Fields, Trafalgar Square in London. And you can see St. Martin's in the Fields on the left. You can see early 19th century early national but sort of colonial revival church next to it, then a genuinely colonial church next to that, and then St. Michael's Church in Charleston, which is a 18th century colonial church, all variations on Gibbs's St. Martin's in the Fields at Trafalgar Square. And when First Baptist Church in Providence, Rhode Island, which was the mother church of colonial Baptists, was erected in 1774, that's on the left and the center picture, Baptist churches nationally took up the Providence model, and it's best seen in Atlanta at George Harwell Bond's Second Ponce de Leon Baptist Church on the right side in Buckhead. That's right next to the Episcopal Cathedral. Ivey and Crook designed several of these Gibbsian porticoed, multi-stage, steepled churches in the St. Martin's in the Field mode for Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian congregations alike. Each was well-proportioned, porticoed that had a temple front, an aisleless basilica church behind with a tower and stage steeple dressed as variations of James Gibbs's London church. And one of the most noble in its siting and masterful detailing is First Baptist Church right here in Decatur, about, not even half a mile from here, from 1951, Ivey and Crook. The church commands its corner site, presenting a monumental temple front with 3 doors crowned with pediments. The center one larger, broken, and featuring a classical urn. Rising from the temple roof is a brick tower with stone coining and stone and framed oculus. And then the tower serving as a base for a secondary temple-fronted upper stage on which rises a tall polygonal steeple with a weather vane. All of that is variations on James Gibbs at Trafalgar Square. And Ivey and Crook provided a similar Gibbsian derivative for the United Methodist Church in Druid Hills. For 7 decades, the church served in-town Methodists whose sanctuary featured the recognized Gibbsian formula of basilica worship space, colossal portico. In the case of St. Martin's in the Fields, it's hexa style. There were 6 columns at that temple. These are reduced to 4, while many of the American derivatives are tetrastyle. Piggyback tower, multi-stage steeple, and like the London church, the 3 entry doors open to a central aisle and 2 narrow side aisles at the interior of the Methodist Church in Druid Hills. This creates these side aisles are just outside the pews, just a kind of walking aisle, and they're marked by these cross barrel vaults, which are perhaps even also somewhat influenced by British architecture. Here, for instance, is on the left, Christ Church Spitalfields in London from 1714 by Hawksmoor, who's a follower of Wren, and you'll notice that these columns are supporting cross-barrel vaults going back to the windows on each side, and that's what's going on the right side at the Druid Hills Methodist Church. Connected to the Ivey and Crook Sanctuary was a Sunday school and a preschool wing, which you can see here, and something of the whole complex. Wide Ionic temple front treated with 2 Ionic columns in antis and capped by a lantern. Well, the dwindling Methodist congregation is no longer steward of the sanctuary and school wing that Ivey and Crook designed in 1953. They have left the church. It now is devoted to residential use. And so what is inside that sanctuary that you just looked at is about 4 condominiums. And you can see on the bottom right, one of those, it's under the arch. So it has some interesting features, but it's all cut up on the inside, and the ancillary buildings have more condominiums. That conversion took place in 2019 by Serber, Barber, Choate, and Hertline. 7 townhouses in the sanctuary, 15 condos in the flanking preschool building, and 3 additional future buildings were projected. We went by on the way here and found one of them is under construction as we speak. The First Presbyterian Church moving to another denomination. This is in Orlando, Florida, also from 53. The temple front is hexastyle, as is the one in London, with Ionic columns, and the steeple is another variation of the stage Gibbsian steeple, perhaps inspired as well by sections of the steeple of the Central Church in New Haven, Connecticut, which I also show on the right. A simpler version of the Gibbsian formula with tetrastyle portico or pared down fluted columns was provided for the congregation of Trinity Presbyterian Church in Atlanta and also First Methodist Church in Thomaston, Georgia, and First Presbyterian Church in Biloxi, Mississippi. So they're doing work all over the South and creating this same variation on a theme. And traveling around the city of Atlanta, one frequently encounters this image of the red brick porticoed, steepled Southern Church, popularly adopted by Methodists and Baptists alike, established especially in the 1950s. Peachtree Baptist in 1954 is typical of the notable tetrastyle Ionic church. There you can see that example. Triple pedimented entry doors, brick tower, stage steeple, all variations on a theme. Here's another one at Audubon Forest Methodist Church from 53, built previous year. And from the same period is Ivey and Crook's proposed sanctuary for Wyuka Baptist Church, continuing the theme of the porticoed and steepled Gibbsian church based on St. Martin's in the Field, London. The several buildings of the Wyuka Church campus developed over time, however. Ivey and Crook's 1955 rendering on the left of what they were proposing for the main sanctuary dates to about the time they built the small extant chapel, which is on the right bottom, which was actually executed. The church itself was not yet built. 6 years later, Ivey and Crook built the so-called interim chapel of 1961 on the bottom right to serve as a temporary sanctuary. And their 1955 rendering of the main sanctuary would guide later construction, but both Ivey and Crook had died before the Wyuka Road sanctuary itself was built. Ed Ivey in September of 66 and Buck Crook in January of 67. So they both died within, 5 or 6 months of each other. And that ended the Ivey and Crook partnership. The main sanctuary itself dates to 1969 to 70. It was built very close to Ivey and Crook's design, but the steeple was not yet built for several years. It took another 4 years. And one of my most vivid memories when I first came to Atlanta in 1973 to start teaching at Georgia Tech was when I was driving around Lenox Square and I looked up at the sky and I saw a helicopter delivering the steeple of Wyuka Baptist Church. And this thing is enormous. I mean, it's just one of the largest steeples in the city. And they just flew over there and gently put it in place. So the main sanctuary from 69 to 70, the steeple added in 73, 74. I think it was in 74 that went on. It is one of the most elegant of the colonial revival church steeples, and the ensemble of Ivey and Crook buildings there at Wyuka with Fuller, who was the architect of the sanctuary when it actually got finished, his main sanctuary. It's long been a landmark feature of this otherwise commercial district of Phipps Plaza and Lenox Square and Upper Peachtree. Well, alas, plans are afoot to raise the Ivey and Crook chapels, sell off the church property along Wyuka, and redevelop the church campus, preserving the main sanctuary, although reconfiguring the interior functions. The church has been renamed the Church at Wyuka. The property is redesigned by Hauser Walker Project Architects and guided by Da Vinci Development Collaborative as project manager. Real estate has become just too valuable at that intersection, and by selling off part of the church property, the dwindling congregation hoped to create funds for an endowment and for other ministries. William Mitchell's catalog resume of Ivey and Crook's commissions ends with projects here in Decatur for the Methodist Children's Home, with final commissions dating from 1964 to 1967. Ed Ivey's death in the fall of 66 ended the partnership, And when Crook died a few months later in January of 67, the history of the firm ceased entirely. We're grateful to William Mitchell, who's an historian who wrote a monograph on Ivey and Crook and did what all people who do major monographs on major architects should do, and that is to include a catalogue raisonné. A catalogue raisonné is a complete list of all buildings by that firm, and because materials had been preserved, Ivey and Crook was able to do that. I made a major effort to do the same thing on the Pringle and Smith book that I wrote, and these become important resources to be able to look. And of course, what Billy Mitchell did was include the building, the date, the job number in the firm, and the address, which in most cases we couldn't find them on all of them, but it was extremely helpful. So today, one can still observe the masterly qualities of design in Buck Crook's residential projects by visiting his own house in 1938 on Peachtree Battle Avenue, which is still preserved, where the architect lived from 1939 until his death. Crook's observations concerning the smaller houses of the historic Old South reflect aesthetic sensibilities evidenced in his own residence and the many suburban houses he designed throughout Atlanta and elsewhere. And he wrote in 1926, quote, "The small houses of the South have not received as ample a recognition as they merit. The majority of them evince careful study in composition and in the intention of the detail, and in some way they are more attractive than the larger and more pretentious homes," unquote. And then he went on to say, architecture is not merely the science of building well. He wrote in 1931, but it is a fine art. It adds high qualities of taste and imagination to good building. And I'm reminded of Ruskin's statement that architecture is that has those qualities that construction and building has, but imposes on its form certain characters, venerable or beautiful, but otherwise unnecessary. That's pure Ruskin, but it's also pure Crook. Philip Schuetze, Cooper and Cooper, George Totten, and others were building huge pretentious houses along West Pacey's Ferry, Tuxedo Road, and Valley Road. But it was Ivey and Crook who translated, quote, "the beauty and charm of the smaller houses of the old house that appealed," as Crook wrote, "to all who appreciate beauty and educated taste." Thank you.